Welcome to the Jesus Movement Live. This is us operating on a Wednesday night here. It's dark and it's raining outside, and it's a pleasure just to come together to share the word of the Lord. We're continuing on with our Journey to Faith series tonight, and tonight we have the pleasure of introducing David for the first time, such an important person in God's plan and such a large presence in the Bible. We are following the genealogy of Jesus, so I thought tonight to open up the lesson that we would start by going to the book of Matthew. And if you open your Bibles to chapter 1, and you'll find that from verses 1 to 17 we have the genealogy of Jesus. When we read this, it actually opens up. So the first word of the New Testament is a record of the genealogy of Jesus Christ, and the Bible says the son of David, the son of Abraham. And so these are these very important linkings for the fulfillment of the prophecy from whom Jesus would actually come. When we go through the descendants, we go from Abraham to Isaac and Jacob in verse 2, and we find that they are the patriarchs as we know them. In verse 3, we go from Judah to Perez and Zerah, and then we move to Hezron, who is the father of Ram. And so we have that period of time when they went down to Egypt, and this was before there was actually the slavery, so they were free people in Egypt during the time of Joseph. Moving on to verse 4, we come to Ram, the father of Aminadab, the father of Nahshon, Nahshon, the father of Salmon. And so this is a period of time where they exit from slavery, they get put under slavery, and they leave the land of Egypt and they wander through the desert. And Salmon, who's the last one in that verse, is actually the first person who will enter the land of Canaan. When we go to verse 5, Salmon is the father of Boaz, who you know well. And Boaz is the father of Obed, and Obed is the father of Jesse, who we've been following up to now. So these are the people that lived during the time of the judges. And then finally we get to verse 6, and it says, and Jesse, the father of King David. And so we find, if we count up all of those names, that King David is actually the 14th descendant in the genealogy of 40 people from the time of Abraham to Jesus. And so it's with that in mind, from this genealogy that we're actually tracing and following each of the descendants, that we're going to continue on tonight. So a bit of an introduction for David. David is actually the youngest son of Jesse, and he becomes the second king of what will become known as the United Kingdom of Israel, and he is anointed by God. Samuel is the person who actually physically anoints him, but it's upon the instruction of God. His life is dated from 1040 to 970 BC, and his reign of Judah was between 1010 to 1002 BC, and the reign of the United Kingdom of Israel is between 1002 and 970 BC. So we learn from this that David didn't automatically rule over the whole country, so we're going to have a look at this tonight as well. Now he's found in the first and the second book of Samuel. He's also found in the first book of Kings, the first book of Chronicles, and they're typically considered to be the only source of information about David, until in excavations carried out at Tel Dan in northern Israel between 1993 and 1994. So Tel Dan is the northernmost point of Israel. There was a broken stele, which is inscribed stone, that was actually found. Now this has become known as the Tel Dan stele, and it's dated between 850 and 835 BC. So I'm just going to put this up on the screen behind me here. And so this is what the stele actually looks like. it contains a phrase in Aramaic, and in that phrase on line 9 here, it actually says the house of David. So we're not going to read all of the script, but line 7, you'll recognise all the biblical characters, and that's why they know that this is the David of the Bible, not another David. And it says, I killed Joram, son of Ahab, king of Israel, and I killed Achaziahu, son of Joram, king of the house of David. And so the significance of this particular find, and it's in the Israel Museum, is that this is what we call extra-biblical evidence for David and the house of David. There is many who will refute that David ever existed, that he was just a character written about in the Bible, but this is not so. This confirms the existence of the Judean royal dynasty because there's more than one generation which is on the stele, and it's believed to be in the mid-9th century, called by the same name. Now David is depicted as a righteous, although fallible king. He was an acclaimed warrior, he was a musician, he was a poet, he composed many of the psalms. Does everyone know, we call these psalms, but does everyone know what a psalm is? What is a psalm if we asked you that in English?
It's a song.
It's a song. So we would actually call them, in the past, we would call them hymns. Hymns or songs of worship. And so we find that the book of Psalms is largely dedicated to everything that David wrote in the Old Testament of the Holy Bible. So David, and this is why he's so significant, is actually vital to the doctrine of Christianity itself. The Holy Bible tells us that David's direct descendant will be the Messiah, Jesus Christ. In Isaiah chapter 9, verse 6 to 7, and so the prophet Isaiah lived 700, or wrote most of this 740 years before Jesus came, in 740 BC. And he wrote, For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government will be on his shoulders. And he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne and over his kingdom, establishing and upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord Almighty will accomplish this. And so we see a very specific reference to King David and also to the kingdom which Jesus will come and he will rule from. And so we have this direct prophetic word. So David is part of our doctrine of our faith. Without David, we cannot believe that Jesus is in fact the Messiah. And hence when we read from Matthew chapter 1, verse 1, it opens and connects David to Jesus and of course to their forefather Abraham. And this is very significant. Now David was born in Bethlehem, in the land allotted to his forefathers from the tribe of Judah. Although the Holy Bible only names his father Jesse, according to the Jewish Talmud, David's mother is called Nitzevet, which is spelled Nitzevet, a daughter of a person called Adael, Adael. And so the Jewish Talmud gives us the feminine names which the Bible has absent. So David, as I said earlier, he's the youngest. He's got 7 brothers. He married 8 wives. Michal, or Michal, as they would say in Hebrew, who is King Saul's second daughter, whom he had given to another man called Paltiel. He also married a person called Ahinoam, who was a Jezreelite, so from Jezreel. Abigail the Carmelite, so from Mount Carmel, who was previously married to Nabal. Maachah, daughter of the king of Geshur. Talmai, and these other names, Haggith, Abital, Eglah, and Bathsheba, who was also previously married to Uriah the Hittite, which is one of the stories of the Bible we'll be going into. The book of Chronicles in the Old Testament of the Holy Bible lists David's sons by his various wives and concubines. In 1 Chronicles chapter 3 verses 1 to 3. So again, that's 1 Chronicles chapter 3 verse 1 to 3. It tells us that while living in Hebron, he had 6 sons, each with a different mother. Ammon by Ahinoam, Daniel by Abigail, Absalom by Maachah, Adoniah by Haggith, Shephatiah by Abital, and Ithream by Eglah. When he moved from Hebron to Jerusalem, so this is the point, he actually ruled from Hebron for 7 years, so he was only ruling over a portion of the land of Israel. It says when he moved from Hebron to Jerusalem, so this is when he took over the ruling of the whole kingdom, his sons by Bathsheba were called Shammua, Shobab, Nathan, and Solomon. His sons born in Jerusalem by other wives included Ibar, Elishua, Nepheg, Japhia, Elishama, Eliada, and Eliphelet. Now they're all written in the second book of Samuel, these names, and you'll find them in chapter 5, verses 14 to 16. So you can see I'm giving a lot of background, a lot of genealogy, all the descendants. It's just to paint a picture of how full David's life was, not just in terms of his own personal story, but he had a lot of wives and a lot of children, and so his life would have been busy and complicated, I would imagine. Not mentioned in any genealogy, 2 Chronicles chapter 11 verse 18 says there is another son of David who's called Jeremoth. David also had at least one daughter, Tamar by Maachah, who was raped by Amnon, her half-brother. The consequence of her rape actually led to the death of Amnon, and you can read about that in 2 Samuel chapter 13 again, this time verses 1 to 29. So following the genealogy of Abraham's descendants, we now embark on a new era, an era when kings are chosen and are actually anointed by God. David's story began when Saul, the first king, is rejected for failing to follow God's commands. God instructs the prophet Samuel, the last of the judges, to select a new king from the sons of Jesse from Bethlehem. So we're going to revert now to the story. So this part that I've given to you so far is really some background to give you some idea of the fact that there's evidence that he was a real person, that he existed. We have information that's genealogically based. He had quite a diverse family. He had many wives and he had many different children. He is the subject of Isaiah the prophet, who forecast or prophesied that he would be this person from whom Jesus Christ would come. We also find out, as I said here, that he had children which are actually not listed in the actual chronicles in the sense of the word, where they're listed as descendant by descendant by descendant. So David, it sounds like, was a busy man, to say the least. So going to his story now, we pick up when Samuel from last week told Jesse and his sons to consecrate themselves and come with him to offer the sacrifice. Asked to present his sons, Jesse introduces 7 of them in order of birth to Samuel, but God tells him that no, they are not the one that he chose. So Samuel told Jesse in 1 Samuel chapter 16 verse 10, he said, "The Lord has not chosen these." And he asks him if he has any more sons. And so he responds in verse 11, "There is still the youngest, but he is tending the sheep." So obviously from this we learn that Jesse had discounted his youngest son as somebody who would be expected to be selected as a king of Israel. He was still a boy who was tending sheep. He obviously had other children. Normally when someone takes a role in a family in these days, it would be the firstborn son. But of course this was not to be. God wasn't actually looking for the next bloodline descendant. He was looking for a righteous person. And he found this in David. So Samuel asked for him to be brought. And he said, "Send for him. We will not sit down until he arrives." When he arrived, Samuel saw a handsome, healthy young man with sparkling eyes. I'm just going to pop up a picture for you. And this picture was on our title for tonight's lesson. And this is a picture of Samuel. We spoke about this last week. But here's Samuel. He's now an elderly man. He's a former leader of Israel. He's a prophet. He gives the word of God to other people. The Bible tells us that he used the horn full of oil, and he anointed David. As you can see, the oil being poured out there. Now you might remember it was on the pretense that they were going to make a sacrifice. So you can see the illustrator has very carefully inserted in this picture here the typical horn altar that was actually used at the time, made out of stone. In fact, if you go to Israel today, if you go to Beersheba, there's actually one of these that was discovered at the Tel. They have a replica there now, but if you go to the museum in Jerusalem, you'll find the original one is actually in the museum. Of course, we assume from this picture that this is probably Jesse, his father, and then he's got all of his family members around him. And of course we have a musical instrument, they're celebrating, and so we see here a bow harp, which would have been typical of what David himself would have been playing. So in verse 12, God instructed Samuel, "Rise and anoint him, he is the one." Samuel took, as I just mentioned, his horn of oil and anointed Jesse's youngest son in the presence of his brothers. Immediately, the Bible tells us, the Spirit of the Lord came upon David in power and would remain with him from that day onwards. And so we learn here that there's a shift from King Saul now to David. Even though he's been anointed, he's still not the king. King Saul is still active. Last week we mentioned that King Saul actually ruled for 42 years. Okay? So David's still got a while to go before he actually takes those burdens of ruling and uniting the kingdom of Israel. So in this point we find that Samuel had obeyed the Lord. He said farewell and then he returned to his home in Ramah. The Bible says, "Now the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord tormented him," in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 14. I'm just going to put up another picture here for you. This is the map that I've created for part of tonight's lesson. And so just to keep us keyed into what's happening, here's Bethlehem, where David was born, where he's being anointed by Samuel. And we see here that this is Ramah up here. So this is all in this hill country. It's only a short distance apart from each other. And it says these other arrows, which we're going to explain in a moment as we continue on with the story. So this is Ramah, where Samuel returned to, where his family home was. So it says that King Saul's servants suggest that they find a man who can play the harp to cheer him up when he suffers. Sorry, just adjusting my mic here. When he suffers. An attendant of the king identifies David, son of Jesse of Bethlehem, as suitable. He told King Saul that David played the harp beautifully. He was a brave warrior, he was a well-spoken and fine-looking man, and most of all that the Lord was with him. So we find that here's David being recommended to King Saul, and at the same time the Spirit of the Lord's gone upon David, and we have King Saul having an evil spirit coming from the Lord as well to torment him. So not long after David was anointed, Jesse received a visit from messengers sent by King Saul. They spoke the king's message in verse 19 of 1 Samuel chapter 16, and he simply says, "Send me your son David, who is with the sheep." So he's identified him by his job description, which is quite interesting, isn't it? Because if we speak to men today and we find out something about them, usually the first thing we find out about someone is, what do you do? And so we find them identifying David as the one with the sheep. So Jesse obeyed. He sent David with a donkey to carry a load of bread, a skinful of wine, and a young goat. So Jesse was a good man. He was sending him with gifts to take to the king's court. David travelled northwards with a donkey and his father's provisions until he left the way to Shur. He arrived at Gibeah and was taken to King Saul. So here on the map we have Gibeah. So we have Bethlehem, Jerusalem, and Gibeah is almost halfway in between Ramah and Jerusalem, but it's off the main road, so to speak. It's not on this way to Shur, which is the main highway. So this is Gibeah here, where King Saul had set up his palace. When he arrived there, King Saul was very pleased with David, and the Bible tells us that placed him into the role of an armour bearer. This was actually a role of honour, for David would carry the weapons of his king, so he would be seen to be with him all the time. If you ever watched any movies about knights, for example, you see that they have armour bearers. So the knights would wear their casual clothes, and before they get on their horse or they go to fight, this person would help them to climb into all their armour. And when we get to Goliath, you find that this armour weighs a lot, and so it needs the help of another man to actually get into this armour. And he says in 1 Samuel chapter 16, again verse 22, "Allow David to remain in my service, for I am well pleased with him." And so it was from then on, David would play his harp to cheer up King Saul whenever he was tormented by this evil spirit. Now 4 generations after the Israelites had entered the land of Canaan, they found themselves, and this is the situation at this point in time, still trying to take control of the promised land. Ruled by King Saul, as we just mentioned, they had fought against the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, and the kings of Zobar. They had inflicted punishment on them, but not actually defeated them. They did, however, defeat the Amalekites. I did mention this last week, their enemy who had attacked their forefathers, and they made peace with the Amorites. Under the previous leadership of the prophet and judge Samuel, they had freed themselves from being ruled and oppressed by the Philistines. For the hand of the Lord, it says in 1 Samuel chapter 7 verse 13, was against the Philistines. So you may remember when we were looking at the period of Judges, we spoke about the Philistines as the last people who ruled over them or came against them. The Bible tells us that they came against them for 40 years. We had the 2 Nazarites, Samuel and Samson, that were raised up, and we also had Samuel as a leader. And so we had this period of time where God was using this plan to change the situation. He knew how long he was going to allow the Philistines to rule over his people. And so we find here in this scripture that the hand of the Lord was against the Philistines. So in other words, he wasn't going to allow them, or to, what's the right description? He wasn't going to allow them to be able to continue to rule over his people. He was going to bring up leaders who are now going to come back against the Philistines, as we learnt. They pushed them back into their lands along the coastal plains of the Great Sea, but they had not defeated them. The Philistines, although beaten, had not given up and continued to wage war against the Israelites. So this is the backdrop of what's happening at this point in time for King Saul and David in his court. After David had entered the service of King Saul, the Philistines gathered their armies once again and camped down between this places called Azekah and Soko. And in answer to the threat, the Israelites assembled nearby in the valley of Elah and drew up a battle line that saw the Philistines occupying one hill, whilst on the other side of the valley, the Israelites occupied another. Does everyone know where this story is going? So we've got the Philistines on one side, we've got the Israelites on the other side, and this is all happening down here. So here's Azekah, I've just mentioned. Here is Soko, I've just mentioned. And so there is a valley here with these hills on either side. And so we find that the Israelites on one side and the Philistines on the other side pitch themselves against each other, ready for battle. David's older brothers, who were of age, Eliab, Abinadab and Shammah, would have been with King Saul, as we know in the Bible, because when David went there, he spoke to his brothers. So David, although one of King Saul's armour bearers, he would have gone back and forth from the camp beside the battlefield to tend his father's sheep at Bethlehem. Basically what that means, at this point in time, David wasn't in the court of King Saul. He was actually called to be his armour bearer and to play music for him. And if you read the Bible carefully, you'll see that they send for him constantly. He's not actually in there in the court. So at this point in time, he would have been called for when King Saul wanted his armour to be put on. Okay. So, as an armour bearer and a musician in this time, you would have understood that there's a fairly personal relationship that's required to be at the king's side. So David was not involved in the fighting at this point in time because he was still underage. He wasn't 20 years or older as demanded by the Lord in order to fight for Israel. Curiously, they had been in camp for 40 days, the Bible tells us, and no one had actually lifted a weapon to fight. So let's see why this was. Now we go to 1 Samuel chapter 17, reading from verses 4 to 7. The story opens up at this point in time. It says, a champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. He was over 9 feet tall. So 9 feet tall is about 3 meters in height approximately. So if you picture yourself, if I picture myself, that's not quite double my height, but it's pretty close to it. So that's a long way up. It's a big difference in size. The Bible tells us he had a bronze helmet on his head, and he wore a coat of scale armour of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. Now 5,000 shekels translates to 57 kilograms. Okay? So his bronze armour weighed as much as some people, just to put it on him. On his legs, they say he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels, or 7 kilograms. And so we get this picture of this very huge man wearing very heavy armour, armoured, so he's got shield, spear, etc. And so he's obviously very intimidating for anybody who wants to come against him. And so I have a picture here which was sent to me by a good friend of mine from a ministry called Lion Ministries in America, and he goes off to archaeological digs, and he was kind enough to send me this picture. Now this picture here is of a potsherd that's actually found at Gath. And so, as I said here, an early Semitic inscription of the name here of Goliath was found on a shard of pottery on what's called Tel Es Saphi, the former Philistine location of Gath. This picture here is on top of the Tel. So when we were over there, they put these compass directions. That's the coast in that direction, and this is the Tel. You may see by the skyline that it's actually a long way up. It's a big, like a hill, a mound. It's fairly nondescript looking today. And this is a picture taken of myself holding this sign which was broken on the ground. And you can see the plains in the background here, and we're up high up here. So this is the coast in this direction. So the point is that these ancient towns or ancient cities, they were high up, and it allowed you to see all the way around to protect it. So this is the place that Goliath came from, and a potsherd was actually found with his name inscribed on there. Clearly we don't know that this was the Goliath. Right? Incredible coincidence, found in Gath, but what it does tell you is that people by the name of Goliath existed in a place called Gath in this particular location, which aligns with the Bible. And so it gives credibility once again that when the Bible talks about places, people, names, they're real. There's artifacts today which demonstrate this. So David, in the story, going back to the Bible, he had been tending his father's sheep in the pasture lands that skirted the fields around Bethlehem, when his elderly father Jesse came out to see him. He had a donkey with him. It was loaded with an ephah, E-P-H-A-H, of roasted grain. Now an ephah is approximately 22 litres, or what's known as 3/5 of a bushel. Okay, so you can probably picture 22 litres of roasted grain, 10 loaves of bread and 10 cheeses. He told David to go and see how his brothers were and give them the grain and bread. The cheeses, however, Jesse told him to give to their commander, and their commander is actually what is known as a leader of 1,000 men. So it wasn't King Saul, it was the brothers' commander. Clearly Jesse was worried about his sons, and he told David in 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 18, "See how your brothers are and bring back assurance of them." And so this is how we know that David himself wasn't at the battle the whole time. He was called in an appropriate time. The Bible told us that they'd been standing there for 40 days and there'd been no fighting. And so there'd been no armour put on by King Saul. So David got up early the next morning, he loaded up the donkey, and he set out for the Israelite camp. In verse 22 of 1 Samuel 17, when he arrived, David gave his father's gifts, and it says, to the keeper of supplies. So that's the person who's responsible to take care of the supplies for the leader of 1,000 men. And he ran out to see his brothers who had just assembled in the battle line, facing the Philistines on the opposite side of the valley. While he was talking to them, a huge giant of a man stepped out from the Philistine lines and shouted to the Israelite ranks. We're reading now from 1 Samuel chapter 17 verses 8 to 10, and it reads, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine, and are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistines said, "This day I defy the ranks of Israel. Give me a man and let us fight each other." Neither his soldiers nor King Saul had the courage to face them. So we see here how King Saul and the Israelites are dismayed and terrified. In 1 Samuel chapter 17 verse 26, it says, "For the Spirit of the Lord had departed from Saul, and the armies of the living God were lacking in faith." And so we find that they didn't front up to the Philistine. He was only one man. They had a whole army. But their fear meant that they weren't faithful to God. They didn't trust or believe that God was in it with them. King Saul, who's meant to be their leader, the Bible tells us that the Spirit of the Lord had departed from him. And so he wasn't emboldened. He wasn't walking with the Lord. He wasn't feeling victorious. And so he just sat back in the background and sent his men out to the line every day and probably hoped that some brave person would step up and take on Goliath, but nobody ever did. And so here we find ourselves 40 days into battle and no fighting had actually occurred. So David overheard the Israelite men saying in 1 Samuel 17 verse 25, "Do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. He will also give him his daughter in marriage and will exempt his father's family from taxes in Israel." He asked the men standing near him in verse 26, "What will be done for the man who kills this Philistine and removes this disgrace from Israel? Who is this uncircumcised Philistine that he should defy the armies of the living God?" So you can see the language of David is very different to the defeatist language of everybody else. The men repeated what they had been saying. But David's older brother Eliab became angry with him, and in verse 28 he said, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those sheep in the desert? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." David was taken aback. In verse 29 he said, "Now what have I done? Can't I even speak?" And so we see here that David, he's a young boy. He's determined to be approximately 15 at this point in time. And his brothers are treating him like a little brother. You know, how dare you come here and tell us what to do? How dare you say that someone should go out there and fight this Goliath. Why aren't you back home taking care of the sheep? They're putting him down in front of the other people. And yet they were there when he was anointed by Samuel as the next king of Israel. And so it's quite extraordinary. So David turned away from his brother and spoke with another man. This was overheard and reported to King Saul, who then sent for him. David placed himself where no other would. And he said to the king in 1 Samuel 17 verse 32, he said, "Let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him." King Saul replied in verse 33, "You are not able to go out against this Philistine and fight him. You are only a boy, and he has been a fighting man from his youth." But David, whose faith was powerful, knew God was with him, and declared to King Saul in verse 36, "Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God." And so David doesn't back down. He's young, but he's faithful. He keeps speaking about the living God. He knows that God is a living God. He has faith in him. He trusts him. So prepared to face Goliath alone, David stood while King Saul tried to fit him with his suit of armour. But he was not used to wearing armour, so David decided to face the giant without protection, physical protection. Goliath despised and cursed David, for he was only a boy. You can imagine, he's this big warrior and this little boy comes out again, so he would feel that this is a way of them showing contempt to him. Why don't you send a real man out to challenge me? Why send this boy? But David responded in verse 45 of 1 Samuel chapter 17, "I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." David had picked up 5 smooth stones from a nearby stream and now confidently swung his sling as he approached. We all know the story from here. So here's this boy. He's whirring his sling around with a stone. There's this huge giant facing him, and David just stands his ground. He swung his sling as he approached, the Bible tells us. He struck Goliath in the forehead and killed him in one blow. David took Goliath's sword and then cut off his head. What do you think happened here? Do you think that the stone hitting Goliath in the head killed him? The physical act of the stone alone killed him? Or do you think God had something to do with this?
Act of God.
Right. So God was waiting for someone to stand up. Right.
But there was also there's this guys that says that he picked up 5 stones.
Yes.
Because Goliath had 4 brothers.
Right.
If you read later in Samuel, they actually chased these, David's captains chased these brothers and go and kill them, the other 4 brothers.
Right. This is what comes next.
Okay, sorry for that. Yeah.
No, that's good. No, that's good, you know. But the point is, though, is that David swung the stone in the sling because he had faith and trust in God that when he did so, he would slay the giant. Okay? And so this is as much about faith and trust as a physical act. God demands us to act in faith. And so when David stood up, it wasn't about his armour, it wasn't about being an adult, it was about the fact that he was prepared to stand up against him, and he kept saying that I have the living God on my side. And so he had faith that when he did this, that he would slay the giant. He mentioned before how he had slain bears and lions. So he said, I'm not fearful. I've killed things that are bigger and stronger than I. So I will do this again. But he's calling upon the living God.
But even if you look at the videos today in the protest, the Palestinians still uses those slingshots.
Right.
And it's not a small stone that thing throws. It's probably the size of a fist.
That's right.
So it coming at the right force, it probably
would do some damage.
will do a lot of damage.
Right. But the premise behind standing up, of course,
That's
is with God, isn't it? And so we find that here, this is what David did. So seeing this, as was mentioned, the Philistines ran away in fear. The men of Israel, so we're just giving a general note here, the men of Israel pursued them that day to the entrance of Gath and to the gates of Ekron, killing many of them. Their dead were strewn along the road. The Philistines returned, but first they stopped at the camp of the Philistines to plunder it. So we just go back to the map. And so for these locations, and so here's the battle, and it says that they fled down to Ekron and down to Gath. So the battle's up here, and so they were returning back to where they came from. And so the roads going down to those two locations, it says that they were strewn with bodies. It says David killed Goliath and the men of Israel pursued them to the entrance of Gath and the gates of Ekron and killed them. So obviously these gates were shut up. So they were chasing them before they made it back into their own defences in this situation. And so this is that area where all of that happened. Okay. So David took Goliath's head. There is some pictures, I didn't bother putting that up. There's this young boy carrying this head that's like, it looks like a huge boulder. He's got this huge sword on his shoulder because Goliath's sword's much bigger than a normal person's. And he took it to Jerusalem along with the Philistines' weapons and placed them in a tent that was his. So again, looking at the map, so they're down here. And so he went back up to Jerusalem and took the stuff up here. So you can see the distances here are not very far. You know, we're talking about a 30 and a bit kilometre distance in the whole lot of all of this. So not big distances. At the time when David had gone out to fight Goliath, King Saul had asked Abner, the commander of his army, whose son David was. But Abner did not know. He brought David to the king, and Saul asked him, "Whose son are you, young man?" And David, still holding the head of Goliath, replied, "I am the son of your servant Jesse of Bethlehem." So that's in 1 Samuel chapter 17, verse 58. So we find here that even though he had called upon David to come and serve him, to be his armour bearer, that he actually didn't know whose son he was. He didn't know whose family he was. And so it's sort of retrospective, isn't it? You find out some information here that seems a bit odd. But he didn't know whose family he was from. So from this day forward, King Saul kept David with him and did not let him return to his father's home in Bethlehem. So the reason he's asking this question retrospectively is because he's still a child. Right? He's not a grown man. He can't say to David, "Look, come and live here with me now." He has to have permission from his father. Okay? And so hence the question. So he didn't let him return, the Bible tells us, to his father's home in Bethlehem. So after David finished talking with King Saul, the king's son Jonathan, it says in 1 Samuel chapter 18 verse 1, became one in spirit with David, and he loved him as himself. And so what we find here is that Jonathan then made a covenant with David and even gave him his own robe, his tunic, his belt, his sword, and his bow. So again, the Bible says, became one in spirit with David. So they became like brothers at this point in time. So the Israelites continued to pursue the Philistines, and King Saul sent David to fulfill a number of tasks. Always successful in every way, David earned the respect of those around him, the army officers, and even earned himself a high rank in the army from his king. When the men were on the way home from the battlefield, the women came out from all the towns of Israel to meet King Saul. They were dancing and singing joyful songs. Some of them even played lutes and tambourines. But the words made King Saul angry, for in verse 7 of 1 Samuel chapter 18, it says that they sang, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." And so here's this boy who is basically humiliating the king with his prowess. Of course, this only served to make King Saul very jealous and suspicious. So I have another lovely picture for you here. And so this is how it's depicted. They would come back from battle. Here's King Saul with his office of authority, his rod, or his staff in his hand. And here's here's David as the younger man here, and all the women following. And so they're all singing, and David's like, "Hi everyone." And here's King Saul looking glum at the head of the crowd. The women are waving date palm fronds as they do in Israel. We learn more about that later in the Bible. But the accolades are going more for David than, of course, than they are for King Saul. So he's not a very happy man. So the next day, David was in King Saul's house, and of course he was playing the harp. David sat there watching King Saul and listened as he prophesied. The king had been standing and holding a spear when he suddenly raised it above his shoulder and hurled it. David moved rapidly and avoided injury. This happened twice, but he was not harmed. One man's blessing had become the curse of another. It says in 1 Samuel chapter 16, verse 14, I mentioned this before, "For when the Lord's Spirit left Saul, an evil spirit sent by the Lord tormented him." Okay? So this isn't just a case of how Saul was feeling. This is a consequence of what God's actually doing here. He's actually going to push Saul in such a way until David takes over from him at this point in time. It says the evil spirit had first manifested as a form of depression, but on this occasion he actually sought to harm David. Failing to hurt David in any way, King Saul became afraid and realised that God was with David, but not with him. And so a shift has finally happened in King Saul's understanding that David was now favoured by God in place of him. David was not expecting what happened next, because King Saul then made him a commander over 1,000 men and sent him to lead the troops in campaigns against their enemies. But sending him away only served to enhance David's reputation, for he was successful in all that he did because the Lord was always with him. King Saul continued to fear David, whilst Judah and all of Israel loved him. David was summoned by King Saul. Received into his home, David humbled himself when he greeted his king. King Saul offered his first daughter Merab in marriage if David would serve him by fighting the battles of the Lord. How do you think David would have taken this? He actually responded in a righteous way. But do you remember what King Saul said back at the battle?
Yeah.
Didn't he say that if they won, that he would give his daughter in marriage? Is David not married? No, he's not. And so here he is making another false promise. So we see some of the character of King Saul coming out here. This is the second time he's done this. But it says that Saul whispered under his breath in 1 Samuel chapter 18 verse 17, "I will not raise a hand against him, let the Philistines do that." See, King Saul believed that David would be killed and he would neither have to honour the marriage nor be guilty of his death. But despite King Saul's plotting, David remains humble throughout. And so we've already mentioned that King Saul understood that David was favoured by God. And so he's making decisions where he thinks, well, I won't do anything myself, which means I'm not doing anything against God. I'll just send him off into battles and increase his risk factor and he'll get killed because he's only a boy. He's not that experienced. So David said in verse 18 of 1 Samuel 18, "Who am I and what is my family or my father's clan in Israel, that I should become the king's son-in-law?" So he displays his humility before the king. Remember, David's already been anointed. So here he is in the presence of King Saul saying, "Who am I?" Well, he's anointed to be the next king of Israel. That's who he is. He's favoured by God and he has the Spirit of God and the power of God with him. And yet he's saying before King Saul, "Who am I?" So this David displays some of his character here, about his humility. It also says about David that he trusts in the Lord because he's prepared to wait, he has patience. Right? These are akin to what we now know in the book of Galatians as the fruits of the Spirit. It says that he has the Spirit upon him. And so he is long-suffering. Right? He is patient. He is kind, and so on. So remember that David is already anointed to replace Saul as the next king of David, yet his meekness and humility shine through as he honours the king chosen before him. Like Jesus, who would come much later, David was born from humble beginnings. In Micah, the prophet Micah, chapter 5, verse 2, it says, "But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah, though you are small among the clans of Judah, out of you will come for me one who will be ruler over Israel." So we see this prophetic word speaks of humility. Although you are small, one will come who will rule over Israel. You see, David trusts the Lord, and no matter what King Saul tries to do to him, he never stops respecting the Lord and understands that it is the Lord's place to deal with King Saul, not his. And so this is something for us to acknowledge. Sometimes we know things are wrong, and yet it's not ours to actually act upon. David knows what's going to happen in the future, but he lets life take its course. He lets God take care of King Saul. He doesn't go up to King Saul and say, "Hey, I've been anointed the next king, so you need to get on your bike and go." He just sits it out and waits for the Lord to handle it in his own time and in his own way. And so he shows his trust and faith in God. So like Jesus, David perseveres in meekness towards his persecutor. He understands that because King Saul seeks to harm him, that it does not excuse him from wrong behaviour, distemper or rashness of spirit. One man's sin does not excuse another in the eyes of the Lord. So how do you think you would measure up under the same circumstances? You've been told, you'd be pretty excited, you're going to be the next king of Israel, you're only a boy. You went out and slew the big giant that nobody else would take on. Every time you go into battle, you do better than everybody else. And here he is in the king's court, and yet he remains humble no matter what King Saul does to him. So Hebrews 12 from the New Testament has much to say about this. I encourage you to read the full chapter. We're also studying Hebrews 12 in our Sunday sermons. So this is a metaphor about running the race of life, but it has much to say in Hebrews 12. So I'm going to pick a couple of points out that are relevant from Hebrews 12 for David's situation. The first one is from Hebrews 12 verse 7. It says, "Endure hardship as a discipline. God is treating you as sons, for what son is not disciplined by his father?" So again, endure hardship as a discipline. God is treating you as sons. So he's telling us here that if things are hard on you, you need to take that as a loving gesture. God is disciplining you. He's actually changing who you are. He's honing you and preparing you for later, for better things to come, for future times in life, for future situations in life, and ultimately for life after we go to the Father. And so he's telling us what son is not disciplined by his father. So this intimates that the things that come against us, came against David, are also part of God's plan for each of us. The second one, from Hebrews chapter 12, verse 10 to 11, reads, "Our fathers disciplined us for a little while, as they thought best, but God disciplines us for our good, that we may share in his holiness. No discipline seems pleasant at the time, but painful." And then it says, importantly, later on, however, it produces a harvest of righteousness and peace for those who have been trained by it. So the discipline changes who we are. It changes how we behave. It changes how we treat others. It trains us for righteousness and peace. And so when we're going through difficult times sometimes, it's hard to see some of those things. And yet this is what God tells us he's actually doing. he's telling us as earthly fathers, and we all have our challenges as fathers, that we only get to discipline our children for a short period of time, as we were by our own parents. They then become adults and they're responsible for themselves. But the sort of discipline that God gives us is for eternity. And it's for good and it's for righteousness. And so the discipline that David's receiving through these difficult circumstances is preparing him for righteousness. He's with a king who's got distemper, who throws spears, who disobeys God. And yet he sits in there and he still does the right thing by the king. And so you can see by that adversity, that when adversity comes against David, he's going to handle it in a different way to the king that was before him. And so this is something for all of us to this day. The third one that I have here is from Hebrews 12 again, this time verses 14 to 15. And it says, "Make every effort to live in peace with all men and to be holy. Without holiness, no one will see the Lord." Very serious words. "See to it that no one misses the grace of God, and that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many." So again, picking this out for David, that no bitter root grows up to cause trouble and defile many. So in other words, if David grew bitter in this situation, he would handle it very differently. It could cost him his life. It could cost him the lives of others. It could change the course of history. God has a plan for David, and so he needs him to behave a particular way in this situation. And so it talks about this in a dual sense, to make every effort to live in peace with all men and to be holy. They've got to go together. And a warning for all of us, of course, is those words, "Without holiness, no one will see the Lord." And so if that doesn't make us think, then I don't think anything will. So King Saul, as I mentioned, he had no intention of honouring his agreement, as we've seen from the first time he did. He actually gave his daughter to another man called Adriel of Meholah. What King Saul couldn't control, however, was that his other daughter, Michal, fell in love with David. But rather than being upset, King Saul is pleased as he plans to use her to entrap David. So going back to the story as the Bible gives it to us now, David was again summoned by King Saul. This time he said in 1 Samuel chapter 18 verse 21, "Now you have a second opportunity to become my son-in-law." Is that not deceitful? You have a second opportunity. So in other words, he's already said he's given him one, but he didn't do it. And he's saying, "I'm going to give you another one." Why would David trust this man? It's quite strange, isn't it? So before David could respond, the Bible tells us the king gathered his attendants around him, and in a low voice not audible to where David was standing, he ordered them to speak to David privately. His attendants approached David and said in verse 22, "Look, the king is pleased with you, and his attendants, all like you, now become his son-in-law." Encouraged by all the attendants, David again showed his humility when he said in verse 23, "Do you think it is a small matter to become the king's son-in-law? I'm only a poor man and little known." And so he's still acknowledging, even though he's been anointed as the next king, that the authority as the king of Israel still sits with Saul. He respects the authority that was appointed to Saul by God. Even though Saul's not doing the right thing, he still honours God's appointment. And so this is again something for us to think about today when we come up against some adversities. The attendants returned to King Saul and told him what David had said. So he told them to return to David and say in verse 25, "The king wants no other price for the bride than 100 Philistine foreskins to take revenge on his enemies." Now I'm sure he didn't physically want the foreskins. I think he just wanted the evidence that he had actually killed these men. So this is the battle price, so to speak. So King Saul's plan was to put David's life at risk. To claim his daughter's hand in marriage, David would need to bring back 100 Philistine foreskins as a revenge on his enemy. Now again, this isn't honourable, is it? Because he's actually declaring up front, I want you to do this as revenge. This is not righteous. David honours the king because God appointed him. He's going to do what he orders him to do. But what King Saul's doing is actually not righteous. And yet this is what he's asking David to do. He's clearly just wanting to put David in the way of danger. So David went out and led his men into battle. But David, being David, of course, he surpassed the king's quota. He came back, and what did he bring back? 200 foreskins. So I don't want to think about his saddlebag. So King Saul was obliged to give his daughter's hand in marriage. So here we find again that King Saul was again forced to acknowledge God's hand was upon David. So he became even more afraid. David continued to fight many battles, and always successful, his popularity continued to increase even further. King Saul's fears only heightened, and he told his son Jonathan and all of his attendants to kill David, so it's escalated. It's now no longer him throwing an odd spear at David or sending him in harm's way. He's actually telling those who attend to him to actually kill David outright. But Jonathan warned David and spoke with his father, and King Saul promised him in 1 Samuel chapter 19, verse 6, as surely as the Lord lives, David will not be put to death. Jonathan spoke with David and brought him to King Saul, and their relation continued as before. War with the Philistines broke out, and again David went out and struck them down. David also returned to King Saul's house and played the harp once again, but yet another episode of distemper struck the king, and he hurled his spear once again. Eluding the spear, David decided to leave King Saul's house that night and return to his own. He was unaware that King Saul had sent men to watch his home that same night with the instruction to kill him in the morning. So he made a promise to his son Jonathan, and King Saul's now going to break that one too. So David entered his home, covered by the darkness of the night, but when he entered, his wife Michal was waiting for him. She was distressed and warned him in 1 Samuel 19 verse 11, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. Gibeah was a fortress built upon a hill, so this is where Saul was residing. The first capital of Israel from which King Saul ruled. David's house was built into the external wall of this fortress. In verse 12 of 1 Samuel chapter 19 it says, so Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. With David on his way, Michal sought to delay knowledge of his escape, so she took an idol, laid it on the bed, covered it with a garment, and placed goat's hair on its head. King Saul sent men to David's house in the morning, but Michal told them that he was ill, and they left. Seems extraordinary. She laid an idol. It was so big that it looked like a human-sized person. So we see here that it seems that it's extraordinary that there's an idol kept in David's home. In Hebrew, the word for this idol is called a teraphim, T-E-R-P-H-I-M. It's the same word used for the household idols that were stolen by Rachel from her father Laban. This reveals, as I've mentioned earlier in the piece, the practice of henotheism is still well and truly underway, and that is the worship of false gods and the worship of the God of Israel at the same time. It was still prevalent in households at that time. She's in the king's court, or king's palace, or king's grounds, king's fortress, and she's got this huge idol in her home. And so it's quite a surprise. So the Bible tells us that David went straight to Samuel in Ramah and told him all that happened. And Samuel took him to a place called Naioth where they stayed. I'm just going to put on this last map here. And so, just a reminder, they're here at Gibeah. And it says, that he went to Samuel in Ramah, and then back to Gibeah again. So he went up and back from Gibeah to Ramah and back again. So Naioth in Ramah, so it's obviously a smaller area within the town there. Sorry, just find my place here. Oh, here we go. So when he arrived, the Bible tells us the Holy Spirit also came upon him, and he too was unable to do anything other than prophesy. Sorry. So David went to Ramah, to Samuel, told him all that happened, and Samuel took him to this place called Naioth, as I mentioned. Meanwhile, back at home, King Saul had sent his men to get David and find that his daughter had deceived them. David was seen, however, and his whereabouts were reported to the king. 3 times he sent men to capture David, only to have them join Samuel and a group of prophets in prophecy. So he went to Naioth and Ramah himself. When he arrived, the Holy Spirit also came upon him, and he too was unable to do anything other than prophesy. So David then fled Naioth and went to Jonathan, the king's son. He asked him why his father was trying to kill him, but Jonathan didn't agree. David told him his father knew he loved David and wouldn't confide the truth to him, so Jonathan expressed he would do anything to help him. David then hatched a plan with him for the next day. It was the New Moon Festival, and David was expected to dine with the king. So a little bit of a background for the New Moon Festival. It's the first time we've mentioned it in this journey. So each new month was celebrated by a new moon festival. It was not determined by any form of astronomical calculation, but rather by messengers who were appointed to look for the first visible sign of a new moon and announce it to the people of Israel. So they had people who were constantly watching the skies. As soon as the first sliver of light was seen, the messengers would set mountaintop signal fires and blow their trumpets, which were called Hodesh, Hodesh. The Hebrew word for month means new moon. And so you may have heard of Rosh Hodesh, which is something that is celebrated in Israel today and by Jews around the world at the beginning of each new moon. So the New Moon Festival consecrated each new month to God. That was its purpose. And although that it was marked by sacrifices, the blowing of trumpets, pausing from work and trade, cancellation of debts, and people coming together for social or family feasts, it was often practiced as a religious ritual by people who had turned their hearts cold towards God. And so you can see here, it's like a reset button, the new moon. All of these things which I've mentioned here, that is marked for sacrifices, comes from Numbers 28, verse 11. The blowing of trumpets comes from Numbers 10, verse 10. Pausing from work and trade comes from Nehemiah chapter 10, verse 31. Cancellation of debts comes from Nehemiah 10:31. I would love that situation. Yeah. Okay, our mortgage is gone, it's the new moon. And people coming together for social or family feasts is from 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 5. Such was the case for King Saul. There was evil in his heart, and he wished to kill David. God spoke about this hypocrisy later through the prophet Isaiah. If we read from Isaiah chapter 1, verses 13 to 14, it says, "Stop bringing meaningless offerings. Your incense is detestable to me. New moons, Sabbaths, and convocations. I cannot bear your evil assemblies. Your new moon festivals and your appointed feasts my soul hates." And so we find here that if they're not actually done with the right heart, God will not accept it. You can be religious, but if your heart's not in the right place, God says here that I cannot bear. It's meaningless. It's detestable. And so David, while this was happening, hid in a field nearby, and Jonathan agreed to see whether his father intended to harm him or not. and based on the outcome he would signal to him whether to join King Saul or not for the festival. David hid himself in the field near King Saul's residence by a well-known stone called Ezel, E-Z-E-L, for 2 nights. King Saul said nothing on the first day when David would normally be with him, but on the second day he challenged his son Jonathan and told him to bring David before him so that he could kill him. Jonathan angrily left his father, and in the morning of the next day he went out into the field with a small boy who he sent out to collect arrows he shot to let David know that it was him. When the signal was made, Jonathan sent the boy back to town with his weapons, and David came out from behind the stone to greet him. Jonathan told him to leave and then went back to the town himself. So in other words, this is it. It's not going to work out. He's not going to ever go back to King Saul, and King Saul's not going to abate from trying to kill him. So David, the Bible tells us, he went from Gibeah to Nob, the town of priests, just outside of Jerusalem. And so Nob is just here. So you can see Jerusalem on the map. Nob is just here, just to the north of Jerusalem. He sought out the priest by the name of Ahimelech. When Ahimelech asked why David was alone, he told him, and it's read from 1 Samuel chapter 21 verse 2. He told him, "The king charged me with a certain matter and said to me, 'No one is to know anything about your mission and your instructions. As for my men, I have told them to meet me at a certain place.'" David asked him for some food to eat. In 1 Samuel chapter 21 verse 3, he said, "Give me 5 loaves of bread or whatever you can find," and for some weapons to protect himself. In verse 8 he said, "Don't you have a spear or a sword here?" There was no ordinary bread on hand, so Ahimelech gave him some consecrated bread. Neither would there ordinarily be any weapons on hand, but Ahimelech said in verse 9, "The sword of Goliath the Philistine, whom you killed in the valley of Elah, is here. It is wrapped in a cloth behind the ephod. If you want to take it, there is no sword here but that one." So while David was visiting with Ahimelech, King Saul's head shepherd, a man called Doeg, D-O-E-G, from Edom, was there and witnessed what transpired. Understanding that King Saul would soon learn of this visit from Doeg, David fled the same day to the Philistine city of Gath to King Achish. Being recognised for who he was, a man who had slain many of their number, David became concerned for his life and pretended to be a madman until he escaped and went to hide out in a cave in Adullam to the west of Bethlehem at the base of the Judean foothills. Does it sound familiar? Who was in a cave at Adullam in the foothills? Samson. Okay, so here we are on the map.
Right.
So he fled, he went down here, this is the highway down to past Timnah, past Ekron, and he would have come back up in here. So it said that he fled towards the coast and he came back and he ended up going into this cave here at Adullam. And so he's now in hiding away from the capital city. David's brothers and his father's household heard of his whereabouts and went to him. Many other men who were in debt or were discontented also went to him. And so it was, it seems, that it was the worst kept secret. That's not what the Bible says. And so it was that David became the leader of about 400 men. But David was concerned for the welfare of his parents who had left their home in Bethlehem. So he travelled first southwards and then eastwards, crossing the Salt Sea, which we know as the Dead Sea, on the way to Moab, the highway that was used when the Jordan River was not in flood. The Bible tells us he took his parents to Mizpah in Moab and went to the king and asked him in 1 Samuel chapter 22 verse 3, "Would you let my father and mother come and stay with you until I learn what God will do for me?" The king agreed. So David's parents remained, and he returned to his stronghold in the cave of Adullam with those he led. Whilst there, David was visited by a prophet called Gad, who told him not to hide but go out into the land of Judah. So he obeyed the word of the Lord given by his messenger and moved from there to the forest of Hereth. And so I'll just bring you up to speed on the map. And so here was David hiding at Adullam. His 400 men came and assembled with him there, and he was concerned about his parents who came with his brothers, and so he went over here. They came up to here. This is where the highway goes past Hebron, past this place called Ziph, past Maon, and this is what's called the way to Moab. Okay, this is actually a road that goes across the Dead Sea. Now, what would happen, this is where they were going to, this is their location, Mizpah and Moab, Ker of Moab. Okay, so this is the capital of Moab, which today is the capital of Jordan, same place. Okay, so I'm going to give you a little bit of a look-see at what this looks like, because this road that goes across here, you couldn't cross it all year. When the rains and the ice melted, the river Jordan would flood and it would increase the level of this sea. And so it would cut off this section of land in the middle, so you couldn't cross it. But when it wasn't in flood, it would recede and there was a pathway where they could go across to the other side here. And so I've got a little short video for you. And this was filmed from Masada, next to the Dead Sea.
Masada. So I'm just facing the camera up in a northerly direction. You can see the Dead Sea there and Jordan on the other side. And as we pan around, you'll see this is where the Dead Sea comes to an end. It sort of stops.
See it here.
And it transitions into these areas, so in this fortress. As we pan around, you'll see the salt farms.
Today you see another line, but these are all salt farms where they're harvesting it. But back in the day they weren't there.
The bottom section there, but the elevation here is extraordinary. And the scale is dodging down there in front. And yeah, it's just breathtaking up here. It's just incredible to be here.
So once again, there's the land bridge over there. Okay, so that video I took from Masada, and so Masada, this is Ein Gedi. Masada is just, you can see where that landmass is. Masada is just about down here. So that's a fortress, that's another story for another time. But from there it's extremely high and you can see right across to the other side. And so this land bridge, you could see the remains, because today the Dead Sea is very low. It's actually been losing water for a long period of time. And so that land bridge has actually become a permanent land crossing. But in the day it was called the way to Moab. So they didn't go all the way around the bottom, they didn't go all the way around the top, they went across here. And this is exactly the same way that Naomi, when she left from Bethlehem to go across to Moab with her husband and her two sons, this is the way she would have went, and this is the way that she would have come back. So they couldn't go across during the times of flood. Okay, so this brings us to this point in the story, because we've been following prior to this week Jesse, the father of David, and of course this is the last time in the Bible that Jesse's actually mentioned. And so we find at this point in time that this is the last mention of Jesse in the Bible, and his mother, but she's not named. David's courage initially benefited his father because he wasn't required to pay taxes. Remember the promise? But now that David feared for his life, protection came from a foreign king, not from their own king. He took him to Moab, to the foreign king. There were enemies, of course, in the past. We do know that Jesse returned to his home in Bethlehem, though, because it says in 1 Samuel chapter 22, verse 4, "For they stayed with him," meaning the king of Moab, "as long as David was in the stronghold," which means he was hiding. So we come to this next week. He goes to hide in this place called Ein Gedi. So that's the stronghold. So we'll come to that next week. We have some film footage for you for that as well. And so it says that they actually came back. So we know they did come back, but there's no more mention of him. And so David left the stronghold after the prophet Gad had visited him. So King Saul heard of David's whereabouts and learnt that he had visited Ahimelech in Nob from Doeg the Edomite. He challenged his officials about David, and he said in 1 Samuel 22 verse 8, "No one tells me when my son makes a covenant with the son of Jesse." So remember earlier I mentioned there was a covenant between them. They were like brothers, that they loved one another. They were of the same spirit, the Bible tells us. So sending for Ahimelech and the priest from Nob, King Saul orders his guards to kill them, but they refused. So he ordered Doeg the Edomite to kill them. Doeg killed the priests, all the people and all the animals living in Nob, but no one escaped. Abiathar the son of Ahimelech, who fled to join David. And so I'm going to close on that note. As I mentioned, David's story is a huge story and a big part of the Bible. So we've run up to the point this week where David's father Jesse comes out of the picture altogether. He's had a role to play throughout this story. And we've gone from this point in time from when David was anointed to killing Goliath, to being successful in battle, to avoiding all of the distemper of King Saul, until it gets to the point now where King Saul just wants him dead. And so he's fled altogether. He's taken his parents to protect them. And of course, he's went into hiding. But then the prophet Gad, who I just mentioned, he told him to come out of hiding and to move around. And so next week's portion of King David's journey is a constant moving of David. He constantly moves around. And so we follow the story, what happens with King Saul, chasing David as he's avoiding him, until the timing is right, when God says, okay, this is the end for you, King Saul. And of course David takes over to rule a portion of the city, a portion of Israel. So thank you for your company. I'm going to bid you good night. Thank you for all of you who've joined us on Facebook. This video will be put up onto YouTube shortly. God bless you. Stay safe.
You